In this video, I'm going to be introducing the concepts of personality, as well as diving into some of the humanistic perspectives on the field of personality. Um, so, one of the things that I think is important to start with, besides these awesome cartoons that I found throughout the internet, is that personality is one of those things that everybody wants to study, especially in terms of psychology, right? It's probably the reason why a lot of you took this course to find out, like, who we are, why we do things the way that we do, and why are people so different across different, you know, whether different cultures, but also different like households and stuff like that. So, in this video, we're going to dive into the definition of personality, what we mean when we talk about that, and then we're going to look at kind of how personality is addressed by a number of different fields, whether that's psychodynamic, which will be Freud, humanistic, or more contemporary ones, the trait perspectives, behavioral perspectives, social cognitive perspectives. All these things are going to play a role into understanding who we are as individuals and understanding how other people, uh, you know, act and behave and those kinds of things. So this is kind of a important unit in that we're going to be going kind of from perspective to perspective, all looking at personality from different lenses. So please make sure that you're writing down any questions that you have that we can answer next time that we're together. So some objectives for this whole unit. And so you can see that there's a lot, right? This first bullet point here is going to be the main component of what we're going to be doing through this kind of the set of videos, with the exception of psychodynamic. We're going to save that for class, in-person class, if we can. But we'll talk about all these things, whether that's the different perspectives. We'll talk about what are the biological bases of our personality, and we're going to talk about how do we assess this, right? What type of personality tests are there? Which ones are good? Which ones aren't good? How to tell the difference? Those kinds of things. So let's dive right in to talk about a definition of personality. So personality is an individual's characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting. I like this image with the seven dwarves, right? I guess maybe except for Doc, all of them have a distinct personality, even though Doc has kind of his own distinct personality. But the other ones are characterized by their names, right? We when it's one of the things that makes the dwarves kind of appealing and funny is that they're named after the dominant personality trait. Um, it actually is going to beg the question that we'll answer later on. But I'll use the dwarves as an example. Were they named that because that was their dominant personality trait, or did that become their dominant personality trait because that was their name? Ooh, deep question to start with. But we will come back to that at the end of this unit and think about what it means to identify as a type of personality and those kinds of things. So when we talk about, right, personality, we're talking about these three major components: thinking, feeling, and acting, right? It's a combination of really the cognitive field, the emotional, the humanistic field, right? The what we just did in class, motivation and emotion, and then our behaviors, right? So the behavioral field. So we're really tying in a number of our more recent focuses of study to talk about personality, which I think is one of the reasons why it can suit itself to this kind of format, as it's a lot of it is going to be review, thinking about how these different perspectives would look at something like, who we are as people. So let's dive right into the humanistic perspective. So this is one that we're going to be most familiar with. It's the one that we were spending some time talking about in class in the motivation and emotion part of Unit 7 here. So let's just start with some review. So you probably remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which started with the physiological and safety needs at the bottom. Moving up, you have the belongingness needs, the esteem needs, and then finally self-actualization. For Maslow, our personality was really determined by our self-actualization, right? Were we able to fulfill our unique potential? And if so, then we are, a certain type of individual, right? We are motivated by these needs to satisfy these needs, including our need to reach our fullest potential. And for Maslow, that was the driving force behind how we think, feel, and act, is that self-actualization, right? Trying to maximize our potential. On the other hand, in humanistic psychology, we also have a guy by the name of Carl Rogers, which is actually someone we haven't talked too much about recently, but who's going to play a major role, especially when we get into clinical psych. Um, Rogers is pretty famous for a number of things. He is really the driving force behind group therapy. He was a driving force behind this idea that patients are clients, right, and that there's this mutual trust between therapist and the person seeking therapy. And as a humanistic psychologist, he was also focused on these self-actualization tendencies, right? That people wanted to fulfill their, their ambitions. And how Rogers got to that perspective and how he emphasized this was through something that he called unconditional positive regard. So again, we'll talk more about this a little bit when we get into clinical psych and the different types of therapies. But basically, what unconditional positive regard means is that you are accepting of other people's feelings. And even when they fail, you still accept them. Even when they struggle, you still accept them. That there's this sense that no matter what they do, that there's always someone in their corner. Now, if some of you are thinking like, well, what about like a serial killer? Like, blah, blah, blah. This is more about I don't want to say about validation, because validation is kind of like an empty word these days, but understanding that like the feelings that you have are valid. You are allowed to have those feelings. Maybe let's not act on it and murder people, right? But this applies to anybody, right? Anytime that you're feeling a strong emotion, it's totally valid that you're feeling that way, right? Like we can't change how other people feel. But what he wants to make sure is that that we have a place to go when we feel those feelings, right? That our need for self-actualization, right? Our need to become the best version of ourselves, right? Sometimes needs this unconditional positive regard. We need people to support us and to hold us up and to, not just knowing that someone cares for us sometimes allows us to move past some of the hurdles that we have in our lives. So let's look at kind of how this plays out. I think this will make a little bit more sense here. And let's take a look at his theory. So Rogers is going to be very similar to Maslow in that we have basic human needs. And one of those needs is the need for self-actualization. And for Rogers, right, he thought that we weren't these like horrible creatures and kind of like, as we'll see with Freud, like that everything is about, sex or violence or something like that, like, or just selfish needs. Rogers says no, like actually most people are pretty, selfless, right? We tend to look to others for the validation that we seek, right? So for Rogers, he says that need for self-actualization is most likely to occur when we have what he called unconditional positive regard, right? That unconditional positive regard, again, understanding that there's, no matter what someone is in your corner, that there's a non-judgmental acceptance for who you are. Those things become really important drivers of self-actualization, right? Understanding that you are accepted, that then leads you to fulfill your potential, right? That then allows you to understand, how to work towards your ideal or best self. On the other hand, right, you can also see that if we have the need for positive regard as well, if it becomes conditioned, right? If you're only accepted because of a certain thing about your personality, right? If you are basically only accepted because you're a good student or a good athlete or because you're funny, right? That's going to lead to self discrepancies. That's going to lead to a break in how you view yourself versus how others view you. Okay. And that's when people are treated, critically or judgmentally, right? We kind of develop these self discrepancies that really pull us away from that self-actualization, right? We aren't fulfilling our potential. We're kind of stuck in this, self-deprecating role where we don't feel like that we belong, or that we don't feel like our personality is somehow lacking, right? And then that lack just feeds on itself. Um, and that also leads to Rogers's other thought, which is about uh, our self concept. Okay, so Rogers really believed that in how, especially within families, that there should be a strong acceptance no matter what, right? That unconditional positive regard should always be met. People should have, unconditional love, that you'll be loved no matter what you do in life. Um, what happens though in life is that we have a difference between our experience and what we think of ourselves, right? Maybe you think of yourself as the person who's going to be the next professional athlete, or you think of yourself as getting into, the Harvard or Yale or something. Um, but maybe that's not actually the case, right? Maybe that's maybe an overinflated idea of who you are, right? So this idea of a self-concept, right? That should somewhat mimic our actual experience. Think of it this way: if you think you're the funniest guy in the world, um, but no one else does, that's going to be really awkward, right? Like, you're going to be making jokes, people aren't going to like them. Maybe you offend some people, and you're going to have this incongruent self concept, right? You're going to see yourself as one thing, but your actual experience is going to be the opposite. And that's going to cause all sorts of stress, all sorts of anxieties that are going to dominate your personality, right? They're going to dominate the way you think, feel, and act in certain situations, right? Maybe you start second guessing, right? Maybe there's an actual opportune time for a good joke and you second guess it, or you believe that this is a good time for a joke, but in reality, it's actually very poorly timed. Um, but if you have this acceptance as to who you are from others, then your self concept is going to be very similar to your actual experience, right? You're going to be that, hey, I think I'm the smartest person in the room, but maybe that means I'm not getting into, even with that, maybe that means I'm not getting into Harvard or Yale, right? Um, that your actual experience more closely mimics how you view yourself, right? Now, we all kind of view ourselves differently from what our actual experiences are, because, we can only see the world from our own perspective, right? Um, but understanding that by having acceptance from other people, right? This is kind of the driving point here, that when we're accepted by others, when we're accepted at who we are unconditionally, right? Again, even with our flaws, that then leads to a greater understanding of who we actually are. And then that more closely mimics our actual experience in the world. So when these self concepts don't match our actual experience, right? There's the feeling of being threatened, and those anxiety reactions increase, which again affects the way that we think, feel, and act in situations. So when we talk about assessing personality from a humanistic perspective, Rogers would actually ask people to describe themselves in these two ways, right? Who are you in reality, and who would you like to be? And he would then basically map out how similar these things were, right? Ideally, we should all be at least moving towards the person we would like to be. Um, we shouldn't necessarily just accept that this is who I am. So therefore, I'll put all my dreams and goals aside and just, oh, this is me. But in reality, right, we want to be able to make sure that we're moving towards our ideals. That the goal for within humanistic psychology, and someone argue, right, just being human, is to strive to improve, right? Is that we always need to make sure that we're trying to do our best. So, as you are preparing and thinking and reflecting on your Who Am I papers, this is really your self concept. I'm asking you in this assignment to assess yourself. Who are you, right? And both in a way, who are you right now in reality? And feel free to throw in some aspirational goals, right? Who would you like to be if who you are is not who you would like to be? So let's wrap up the humanistic perspective here. So let's evaluate it and see what the criticisms and successes are. So humanistic psychology as a whole has had a major impact on the field of psychology, ranging from education to childcare to therapy. Um, one of the most dominant types of therapy these days is a more humanistic perspective, um, in terms of how people treat their clients, how people respond when they're presented with challenges, some of the advice that's given. Right, this is very humanistic field in terms of just general counseling. Um, but we also need to be, a little skeptical of the humanistic perspective because it's not very data driven. Remember, we said that the main difference between uh, um, humanistic psychology and positive psychology is way more empirical, right? They have that scientific basis, whereas unconditional positive regard, self actualization, right, fulfilling your own potential, like these are kind of vague terms, and they're going to mean something different from everybody, so they become almost impossible to study from a scientific perspective. And then, really, the other criticism here is that this idea of a self concept, which includes things like gender identity and sexual orientation and how we view ourselves, right? Um, that those things probably develop a lot earlier than expected. That humanistic psychology really puts an emphasis on. They put that, mid childhood is when those things start to develop. But we know that there are, significant, that gender identity in particular tends to be developed much earlier than that. So that's the humanistic perspective and personality, right? So some of the key terms we talked about is we defined personality in this video. We also talked about unconditional positive regard, self-actualization, and a congruent or incongruent self-concept based off of how others respond to us in our lived environments. In the next video, we're going to be covering the trait perspective, which is the dominant perspective on personality in the 21st century. And we will pick that up in the next video. So any questions, make sure you're writing them down and you're sending them along. And I hope you are all, thinking about, from a Rogerian perspective. That's a Rogerian? I guess that's right. But, reflecting on who you are, and this idea of a self concept, I think is a really powerful idea to spend some time just thinking and reflecting on. Okay. I'll see you in the next video talking about trait perspectives.